welcome everyone. Thanks for being here today. We are really excited to have you here at our symposium to present our newest work. I'll briefly introduce the whole symposium and then I'll move on for my talk, which will be the first one. So the general background to the research that you'll be hearing from us today is the notion that humans are extremely social and that they tend to be in a wide range of contexts, seem to be influenced by others around them, so by the visual or mental perspective of others or what others might do or represent or see and so on. And so these kind of effects that we refer to as alter-centric effects have been by now very well documented in a wide range of scenarios in adults as well as infants by now. Generally speaking, one claim is that, or one idea is that this might be a general feat of human cognition, broadly facilitating social interactions, predicting others' actions, and just social existence in general. But if you were here yesterday morning at the keynote, then you have already heard that there's some recent proposals suggesting that in infants this might be even more so. And in particular that it might serve a unique function. But there is still many open questions, and actually just they're accumulating with the more research we have. So these include what type of information or content can be encoded or represented alter-centrically or is affected by the presence of others. In what context can we find these? For example, effects on memory, or how does communication influence this? How might it change with age? And you have heard some potential trajectories proposed of alter-centric effects, and how it might relate to other forms of social cognition, for example, with explicit theory of mind. So in this symposium that we put together with Charlotte, you will hear 3 talks and a discussant in the end. In the first talk, I will be talking about alter-centric effects on semantic processing. The second talk will address communicative context. And the third talk will discuss a little bit older children and also relation to theory of mind. And we will end with Olivier Mascaro discussing what he thinks about these findings. Right, just to very briefly recap Victoria's talk yesterday, or the main claims from this alter-centric account, or the proposal of an alter-centric bias in infants. So the general idea is that very early on, there might be a pronounced emphasis on the perspective of others, or the target of others' perspective, so much so that, that the perspective of others might trump that of infants' own, and this might be partially enabled by their still developing concept of self. And exactly, so as another part of this proposal is that as the self concept develops, the own perspective gains strength as well. So this has a prediction for ontogeny for altercentrism, in that it should decrease with age. One thing that Victoria hasn't gone into too much detail yesterday, but she referred to it several times, is that one idea is also that this pronounced sensitivity to the perspective of others early on by infants might have a special function, namely to attend to relevant information via the perspective of others, so to learn about the environment and basically use others as a tool for that. But generally speaking, one sort of prediction by this account is that how infants process the world around them should be influenced by the perspective of others. So in my talk, I asked the question whether infants encode meaning or semantic information from others' perspective. So why is this interesting? So far, we have seen quite a bit of evidence accumulating that infants are biased by others in their memory for location of objects or the presence or absence of objects. However, if we take this proposed learning function seriously, then actually location information is not that, not necessarily the only or the most relevant type of information to encode, but rather types of information that are less transient than location. So for example, semantic information such as object kind. So the question we asked is whether category information could be also extracted from the object via the other's perspective. And so we asked this question in the context of labeling events, so labeling targeting a referent, referring to the object kind, or if the referent is not in sight, then our labeling event would refer to the representation of a referent. So basically we asked whether infant's representation of object kind can be altercentric. Right. So to answer this question, we turned to an EEG measure, the N400 ERP component that indexes or correlates with detection of semantic mismatch or increased processing of meaning. This has been found extensively with adults. But also with infants, definitely around 14 months of age, also younger, but around 14 months, it seems a robust effect. So for example, if infants see a shoe and then someone labels that shoe a car, then they show a larger N400 response. This is a negative ERP response about 400 to 600 milliseconds after they hear the label and in these parietal areas. So in one experiment that I won't go into detail now, we replicated this finding in a context where the infant doesn't see the object when it's being labeled. So an object is hidden into a box, and then a hand points towards the box, and they hear the label. And again, if the label doesn't match what was hidden in the box, they show an increased N400 effect. So, right, so that tells us that it could signal something like a mismatch or an increased processing due to a mismatch between infants' sustained representation and what they hear, so the label. And in what follows, I will present two studies where we asked whether infants' detection of semantic mismatch might be modulated by the perspective of another person. So how do we do this? We presented infants, these were 14-month-olds, Danish-speaking infants, with videos where they saw a person put an object into a box. And then in this study, this object was always exchanged, and the person never saw this exchange. And then finally, a hand pointed toward the box, and infants heard a labeling. So something like, wow, duck. And so we used two types of labels. We used labels that were always incorrect for the infant. So it never actually matched what's inside the box. But in half of the trials, the label matched the first object, so the one that they witnessed together with the other person. And so this paradigm was influenced by or inspired by other work previously, also with adults and also infant work by Brian Forgach and others, where they found this N400 effect also in a social context, so when there was a mismatch for someone else. And so here we reasoned that an altercentric influence would predict a smaller N400 effect if the label matches the co-witnessed object. So again, this is in a context where the label is always incongruent for the infant, so if they just process it from their own perspective, they should show no difference between these two types of labeling. So this is how it looked. So the green dot that you see is the infant's gaze. And there's no sound here, but here's where the labeling comes. So, wow, duck. And so at this point, in this example, from the agent's perspective, what's inside is a duck. From the baby's perspective, it's a shoe. And then we either label it a car, which is incorrect for both of them, or we label it a duck. And so what we find is basically a difference between these two conditions. So again, let me remind you that both of these labels are incongruent for the infant. What's different between them is that what you see with the blue line here is congruent for the other. I label it such that, it signals congruence for the other person, but basically it's congruent with the co-witnessed object that they saw together. So what we think this means is that the M400 effect that reflects processing of meaning is, in this context, affected by the other's perspective, and that the co-witnessed object exerted a stronger influence on infants' memory than the one that they did not witness with the other person. So in other words, when we probe the strength of representation, based on what they show this response to processing of meaning, then the congruency from the other's perspective lowers their mismatch response. And so we also collected some demographic data from the families, and very exploratorily I looked at whether the size of this effect correlates with the time they spent with certain family members. And so here parent A refers to whoever filled out the questionnaire. This is about 75% the mother, but so there's a correlation between the larger the effect, so the more negative here, the more time they spend with the parent, or the other way around. This is very exploratory, but it's also just to indicate we're trying to look into what could be the factors that feed into this kind of processing. Right, so infant semantic processing showed an allocentric influence, but a proper allocentric bias would predict that their own perspective may not inform semantic processing at all. So if there's incongruence from their own perspective, but for the other, from the other's point of view, it's always congruent. Would they process this at all, is the question. Right, so in other words, does the other's perspective override infant's own? Or does encoding from the other's perspective override from infant's own? And so to test this, we ran another study that looked like this. These are the two conditions. They start the same way. The person, again, puts the object into the box. And then the object is, again, always exchanged. But in the scene swap, she sees this. In the unseen swap trial, she doesn't see it. This exchange. She always disappears briefly. She always disappears in the end. And then again, there's a labeling. And so we label it such that the label always matches what the other has seen there last, right? So when in the scene swap, it's the second object labeled. In the unseen swap, it's the first one. So it's always congruent for the other. But in the unseen swap, it's incongruent for the infant, right? Because it doesn't actually match what's currently in the box. So again, this is kind of a social context replication of previous paradigms, where we know that infants show a mismatched response to a mismatched labeling. But now there's another person for whose perspective this always matches. Right, so this is just a depiction of the same thing. So when we label it with the first object in the unseen, then it should be congruent for the other person, but incongruent for the baby. And so what we find here in this condition is no difference between conditions. So even though there's a difference between the two conditions from the infant's point of view, and there's incongruent labeling, the congruency from the congruency from the other person's perspective seems to override this, and they do not seem to process their own incongruency. Right, so on the top is just the first study that I didn't talk about to establish kind of proof of principle. So these two studies together show essentially that the infant's N400 response varies as a function of congruency as encoded by the other's perspective and not by their own. So it might be, or it's congruent with the possibility that others' perspective may take priority when encoding the environment. And in particular, we found an allocentric bias in semantic encoding, which is what a potential learning function of such a bias would predict. So one question that arises, that we already referred to, is what could be the developmental trajectory of this kind of processing. So if the claim is that allocentric bias decreases in the first few years of life, then older infants might not spontaneously show this bias. And in line with this, we know that for adults, for example, in the original social N400 studies, adults only show these effects when you prompt them to follow the other. And also in Balint Forget's work with N400, you have to instruct the adults to follow the perspective of other, or it's sensitive to other contextual factors. And also, you have heard in Victoria's presentation evidence showing, or in line with a decrease in allocentrism around the first year of life. But just very briefly, another way how we try to address this question is using a search task that has been used previously to look at object permanence in infants. So this is previous work showing that infants search longer in a box when they believe an object is still present in there compared to when they believe the box to be empty. And in previous work with Agi Kovac, we showed that this effect exists also in a social context. So 14-month-olds searched longer in a box when not they themselves, but another person believed an object to be present there. And so they show this, what you see here is kind of a longer search. So above 0 is a longer search when, in the Fagenson case, when they themselves believe an object is there, and we found the same effect if the other believes an object is there. So without going into much detail, we looked at this effect between 12 and 13 months of age with 80 infants in each half-a-year age bin. And we used 2 types of trials. One are baseline trials that are replications of this effect of object permanence, and belief trials where there was another person who either believed there's nothing in the box or there's something in the box, and we wanted to see whether there's a change in development in this effect. So first of all, what we found is that in the youngest age, the task didn't work very well because we optimized it for older infants, so it was way too complicated. There's tons of studies showing this effect at these ages, so I don't think this is too meaningful beyond just us knowing that we can't really look at the belief trials in this age, sadly. But the tasks seem to be working well in the older ages, so the green bar is searching for when there is an object actually in the box. Blue is when there isn't. So it's scaled well in the older ages. And so what we found is that if you look at the 19 to 24-month-olds and then 25 to 36, there's a drop in this ultracentric effect, and really the only ones that show this effect were with whom the task worked in the baseline trials and the younger age group of the 2, so this 19 to 24-month-old. Right, so briefly to summarize, we found an ultracentric bias in semantic processing, and we found a decrease from the second to the third. This is a typo, 24 to 36-month-olds, which is in line with a drop in relation to the emerging self concept, but we also looked at relation with the mirror task. We didn't find an effect there, but I can answer questions if you're interested why I think that's the case. And yeah, it still leaves several open questions. So what type of representations underlie this processing? How might these effects arise in what context? So that's kind of projecting ahead Bartu's talk, and whether the conditions that elicit this kind of processing might change over development. And yeah, that's to project ahead Marie's talk. And with that, I thank all my collaborators and thank you for your attention.
Okay, we have 2.5 minutes for questions. And we wanted to give priority actually to junior researchers in old tradition of the BCCCD.
No pressure.
So thank you for a very nice talk. So since you raised the question at the end of your talk, what kind of representations might underlie these putative alter-centric effects? So we've seen that there are at least 2 possibilities. You have an attentional enhancement through monitoring the perspective of others, which was well described by Vicky in her talk, but a more traditional view on this would be, maybe among infancy researchers, would be to assume that this involves some representations of beliefs, or maybe you can imagine also other processes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think this is now one of the very interesting questions, and we just really don't know, and I'm not really sure how exactly to address it, because I think all of these are consistent with either. There's kind of indirect evidence, and Vicky discussed a lot of that yesterday. You know, evidence from elsewhere, like it would be hard to represent both, and you know, while that's true, we don't know actually whether they do it here or not. In principle, since we know adults can be ultracentric and adults can meta-represent, so you know, it's very possible that you actually ascribe a belief, but it's simply so much emphasis on the other's perspective that it still overrides your own, or it can be that it's actually just, you know, it's a fundamentally different type of mechanism, and I think that will be the interesting thing to address and disentangle. I see a question there.
Yeah, it's just a very quick and maybe, I don't know, naive question. So do you think that the other here is a kind of general other? Or if, I don't know, there was a way to track the identity of the other, would that be important?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, from other work, we know that infants can distinguish between knowledgeable and not knowledgeable and so on. So they are sensitive to who the source is. I personally think, and I think we have evidence suggesting that they don't actually encode who it's coming from. So that type of information is not stored until possibly much later, several months later after this age. So I don't think we have good evidence that they would store who it's coming from, even if it in the moment matters. And we know that it does matter there. But whether they actually remember that or encode it such, I don't think so. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, let's
Thank
thank
you.
Dora again.